My name is Amelie, and I'm going to tell you the story of how my dream came true, then turned into a nightmare. It all started 5 years ago, when my husband, Pierre, and I decided to buy our first home. We'd been married for 3 years and had saved every penny we could to make this dream come true. I still remember the day we signed the papers at the notary's office. It was a sunny spring Tuesday morning. Pierre and I were sitting side by side, our hands intertwined under the table, trembling slightly with excitement. When the notaire handed us the pen to sign, I felt my heart beat so fast I was sure everyone in the room could hear it. "Voilà, Madame and Monsieur Dubois," said the notaire with a warm smile. "You are now the official owners of your new home. Congratulations." Pierre hugged me, and I felt tears of joy roll down my cheeks. We'd done it. After years of sacrifice, cheap meals, cancelled vacations, and endless overtime, we finally had our own house. The house itself wasn't extraordinary. It was a modest 2-story house in a quiet suburb of Lyon. It needed some renovation, but to us, it was a palace. Each room represented a promise of the future, a space where we could create our own memories. On moving day, friends and family came to help. The atmosphere was joyful and hopeful. My mother, Marie, couldn't stop crying with joy as she arranged the curtains in the living room. "Oh, my darling," she said between sobs, "I'm so proud of you too. You've worked so hard to get here." My father, Jean, was more reserved in his emotions, but I could see the pride shining in his eyes as he helped Pierre assemble our new bed upstairs. That evening, after everyone had left, Pierre and I sat on the floor of our new living room, surrounded by half-unpacked boxes, sharing a pizza and a bottle of cheap champagne. "To our new life," Pierre said, raising his plastic glass. "To our new life," I repeated, my heart overflowing with happiness. However, our joy was soon to be tinged with trepidation. A few weeks after we moved in, I received a call from my mother. Her voice trembled as she told me that my father had lost his job. The company he'd worked for 30 years had decided to relocate, leaving hundreds of employees out in the cold. "Don't worry, Mom," I said, trying to reassure her. "It'll be all right. Dad will find another job." But deep down, I knew it wouldn't be easy. My father was 58, and finding a new job at his age would be a challenge. As the weeks passed, my parents' situation worsened. They were struggling to pay the rent, and their bills were piling up. One evening, as Pierre and I were having dinner, I broached the subject that had been bothering me for days. "Honey," I began, hesitantly, "what would you say if we invited my parents to live with us for a while? Just until they get back on their feet?" Pierre put down his fork and looked at me thoughtfully. I held my breath, fearing his reaction. After all, we had only just begun our life together in our new home. But to my great surprise and relief, he smiled and took my hand in his. "Of course, my love," he said softly. "They're your family, and now they're mine, too. We have room, and they need help. It's only right to support them in their time of need." I felt tears welling up in my eyes, overwhelmed by the gratitude and love I felt for this wonderful man. The next day, I called my parents to make the proposal. At first, they refused, too proud to accept what they saw as charity. But after several conversations and much persuasion, they finally agreed. The day they arrived with their suitcases, I felt that our house was really becoming a home. Seeing my parents settle into the guest room, hearing my mother's laughter in the kitchen as she prepared dinner with me, watching my father and Pierre chat in the garden. Everything seemed perfect. The weeks that followed were filled with moments of simple happiness. We ate meals together, watched movies as a family in the evenings, and on weekends, we all worked together to improve the house. My father repainted the living room, my mother planted flowers in the garden, and Pierre and I finally finished unpacking all our boxes. One evening, as we all sat in the living room after dinner, my father raised his glass and said with emotion, "I want to make a toast. To Amelie and Pierre, who have opened their home and their hearts to us. You are extraordinary children, and I'm proud to call you my family." That moment will forever be engraved in my memory as one of the most beautiful of my life. I had the impression that everything was in its place, that we had created a haven of peace and love in our little home. Little did I know then that this happiness would be short-lived. That soon, our dream would turn into a nightmare, and our close-knit family would be tested in ways I could never have imagined. But right then, sitting in our living room, surrounded by the people I loved most in the world, I felt fulfilled. Our home was more than just a brick-and-mortar building. It was the beginning of a new life, full of promise and hope. And despite the difficulties we were going through, I firmly believed that as long as we stayed united, we could overcome any obstacle. If only I'd known what lay ahead. The weeks passed peacefully in our new home. The presence of my parents had created a warm, homely atmosphere that I cherished every day. However, I couldn't help noticing that Pierre seemed increasingly tense. He was coming home late from work, spending a lot of time on the phone in the garden, talking in a low voice. I put it down to stress at work, but I should have paid more attention to the signs. That Sunday began like any other. I'd gotten up early to prepare a big family brunch, a tradition we'd started since my parents arrived. The smell of freshly ground coffee and warm croissants filled the house. My mother was helping me cut the fruit while my father and Pierre had gone to buy the newspaper. "You look tired, darling," my mother remarked, looking at me with concern. I shrugged, trying to look casual. "Oh, it's nothing. I just didn't sleep well last night." The truth was, I was worried about Pierre. His distant behavior of late worried me, but I didn't want to tell my parents. Not yet, anyway. Suddenly, the doorbell rang. I frowned in surprise. We weren't expecting anyone. "I'll get the door," I said to my mother. As I opened the door, I froze in place. Before me stood Francoise, my mother-in-law. Her steel-grey eyes stared at me with an intensity that made me shiver. "Hello, Amélie," she said in a cold voice. "May I come in?" Without waiting for my answer, she gave me a gentle push and entered the house. I was speechless, unable to react. Francoise and I had never had a close relationship. She'd always thought I wasn't good enough for her son, but she'd never been openly hostile. Until today, that is. "Francoise," I said, finding my voice again. "What a surprise. We weren't expecting you." She turned back to me, her gaze sweeping the house with disdain. "Obviously," she replied curtly. My mother came out of the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. "Oh, hello Francoise," she said with a forced smile. The tension in the air was palpable. "Marie," Francoise nodded coldly. Then, turning to me, "Amélie, I'd like to talk to you. In private." I glanced at my mother, who nodded imperceptibly. "Of course," I replied. "Let's go into the kitchen." Once in the kitchen, I closed the door behind us. Francoise stood, refusing the chair I offered her. Her face was flushed, and I could see the anger bubbling just beneath the surface. "What do you think you're doing, Amélie?" she asked abruptly. I blinked, caught off guard. I don't understand." "Don't play innocent with me," she hissed. "This house. Bringing your parents here. Do you have any idea what you're doing to my son?" I was dumbfounded. "Francoise, I really don't understand. Pierre and I decided together to invite my parents. They're going through a difficult time and—" She cut me off with a curt wave of her hand. "Enough. I don't want to hear your excuses. This house was supposed to be for you and Pierre, not to house your unemployed family." His words hit me like a slap in the face. I felt anger welling up inside me, but I tried to remain calm. "My parents are here temporarily. We're a family, Francoise. We help each other through thick and thin." She let out a mirthless laugh. "Family? You really think you're part of our family? You're just an opportunist taking advantage of my son's kindness." I clenched my fists, struggling to keep my composure. "That's not true. I love Pierre, and he loves me. We made this decision together." Francoise approached me, her face inches from mine. I could feel her warm breath on my cheek as she uttered the words that would change my life forever. "Listen to me, you little fool. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to pack your bags, take your parents and all your miserable possessions, and leave this house. You'll give it to Pierre and me. If you don't, I promise you my son will file for divorce faster than you can say it." I recoiled, shocked by the vehemence of his words. You can't do this," I stammered. "This house is ours. Pierre would never do that." She smiled, a cold, cruel smile that chilled my blood. Oh, my dear. You don't know my son as well as you think. He'll do what I tell him to do. He always has. I shook my head, refusing to believe what I was hearing. No, you're lying. Pierre loves me. He would never do that to me. Love, giggled Francoise. Love doesn't pay the bills, my dear. Love doesn't guarantee a stable future. Pierre needs someone who can offer him more than just nice feelings and a family of parasites. Her words hurt me deeply, but I refused to show it. I straightened my shoulders and looked her straight in the eye. I don't know what you're trying to do, Francoise, but it won't work. Pierre and I are happy here, with my family. If you have a problem with that, I suggest you talk to your son about it. She stared at me for a long moment, her eyes shining with cold anger. Then, without warning, she headed for the kitchen door. Before exiting, she turned one last time. You have until tomorrow to pack and leave. If you don't, I promise you'll regret it. With that, she left the kitchen. I heard the front door slam a few seconds later. I stood there motionless, trying to understand what had just happened. My mother entered the kitchen, concern etched on her face. Amélie, what happened? I heard voices. I turned to her, tears in my eyes. Mama, I don't know. Francoise, she wants us to leave. She says if we don't, Pierre will ask for a divorce. My mother took me in her arms, rocking me gently as when I was a child. Oh, my darling. This can't be true. Pierre would never do that. But doubt had already crept into my mind. What if Francoise was right? What if I didn't know Pierre as well as I thought? The rest of the day passed in a haze. I said nothing to my father, not wanting to worry him. When Pierre came home, I watched him carefully, looking for signs of duplicity, of lying. But he seemed normal, perhaps a little more distant than usual, but nothing to justify his mother's accusations. That night, lying in our bed, I listened to Pierre's steady breathing beside me. My mind went round and round, replaying the conversation with Francoise over and over again. What should I do? Confront Pierre? Ignore his mother's threats? Leave as she had demanded? I knew one thing, I couldn't stand by and do nothing. Tomorrow, I would talk to Pierre. I would demand answers. Our love, our marriage, our life together, it was all on the line. And I was determined to fight for what I believed in. As dawn began to break, I made my decision. Whatever happened, I would face this storm with my head held high. After all, wasn't that what being a family really meant? To stand together in the face of adversity, to support each other, and to fight for those we love. With this resolution in mind, I finally closed my eyes, ready to face whatever the next day would bring. The next morning, I awoke before Pierre, my mind still clouded by the previous day's events. The sun filtered through the curtains, casting dancing shadows on the wall of our bedroom. I lay there for a while, listening to my husband's steady breathing, trying to gather my courage for the conversation I knew was inevitable. Finally, I got up slowly, taking care not to wake Pierre. I went down to the kitchen, where I found my mother already preparing breakfast. "Good morning, darling," she said softly, handing me a cup of steaming coffee. "You look exhausted. Did you manage to get some sleep?" I shook my head, taking a sip of coffee. "Not really. Mom, I need to talk to Pierre today. I need to know what's going on." She nodded, understanding. "You're right. Your father and I will go out and run a few errands this morning to give you some privacy." I smile at her, grateful. "Thanks, Mom." Soon after, I heard Pierre coming down the stairs. He entered the kitchen, his hair tousled and his eyes still sleepy. "Good morning," he mumbled, walking over to the coffee pot. I took a deep breath. "Pierre, we need to talk." He froze for a moment, then turned slowly to me. "Okay," he said calmly. "What's this all about?" "Your mother came yesterday," I began, watching his reaction carefully. His face paled slightly, but he kept a neutral expression. "Oh, what did she want?" I clutched my coffee cup, searching for my words. She told me things, Pierre. Things that upset me. She wants me and my parents out of the house. She said if we didn't, you'd file for divorce." Pierre remained silent for what seemed like an eternity. Then he sighed deeply and sat down across from me at the kitchen table. Amelie, I'm sorry. My mother shouldn't have come here and told you those things. My heart clenched. So, is it true? Are you really considering divorce? He ran a hand through his hair, clearly uncomfortable. No, it's not. It's not as simple as that. Then explain it to me, I insisted, fighting back the tears that threatened to fall. Because I don't understand, Pierre. I thought we were happy. I thought we were a family. He took a deep breath before beginning to speak. My mother, she's been pressuring me for weeks. She never approved of our marriage, you know that. And now, with your parents living here, she thinks you're taking advantage of me. I felt anger rising inside me. And you believe her? After all we've been through together? No, of course not, he answered quickly. But you don't know my mother like I do, Amelie. She can be persuasive. Persuasive, repeated I, incredulous. Pierre, she's threatening our marriage. How can you even consider listening to her? He lowered his eyes, avoiding my gaze. It's not just that. My mother, she wants the house for herself and her new companion. This revelation hit me like a punch. What? But, this house is ours. We worked so hard for it. Pierre nodded sadly. I know. But my mom thinks she needs the space more than we do. She says she'll help us financially in exchange. I couldn't believe my ears. And you considered accepting? He hesitated a moment before answering, and that moment of hesitation broke my heart. I've thought about it, yes. Not seriously, but I've thought about it. I stood up abruptly, unable to sit still any longer. I just can't believe it. How could you keep this from me? How could you even consider giving in to this blackmail? Pierre stood up too, trying to take me in his arms, but I backed away. Amelie, please try to understand. My mother has always been a great influence on me. I know it's not right, but… Not right, interrupted I, my voice trembling with anger and grief. Pierre, this is much more than not well. It's a betrayal. To me, to my parents, to everything we've built together. He lowered his head, looking ashamed. You're right, I'm sorry. I'm sorry about that. I should have told you from the start. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the emotions swirling inside me. Pierre, I need to know. Are you really willing to sacrifice our marriage, our life together, to satisfy your mother's whims? He raised his head, looking me in the eye for the first time since our conversation began. No, he said firmly. No, I'm not. I love you, Amelie. I don't want to lose you. I felt a slight relief at his words, but the trust had been shaken. So what do we do now? Your mother isn't just going to give up. Pierre sighed. I know. I'm going to talk to him. Make it clear that this is our house and we're not leaving. That your parents are welcome here for as long as they need. What if she threatens to separate us again? I asked, fear piercing my voice. He took my hand in his. Then I'll tell her that if she makes me choose, I'll always choose you. You're my family now, Amelie. You and your parents. His words should have comforted me, but I couldn't help thinking how close he'd come to giving in. How could I be sure he wouldn't change his mind again? I need time, I said finally. To think things through. To decide if I can still trust you. The pain in his eyes was obvious, but he nodded. I understand. Take the time you need. I'll be here when you're ready to talk again. I left the kitchen, climbed the stairs and locked myself in our bedroom. Sitting on the bed, I finally let out the tears I'd been holding back. How had it come to this? How had our dream turned into this nightmare? The hours passed, and I stood there, lost in thought. I thought back to all the happy moments Pierre and I had shared, to the love I'd believed unshakable. But now, everything seemed fragile, uncertain. I knew I had to make a decision. Could I forgive Pierre for considering giving in to his mother's demands? Could I trust him again? And even if I could, how were we going to deal with his mother in the future? One thing was clear, I couldn't go on living in uncertainty. Whatever my decision, it would have to be made soon. Our marriage, our future, all depended on what I chose to do now. As the sun began to set, casting orange shadows across the room, I stood up. I needed some fresh air, some time to think away from this house that now seemed stifling. I grabbed my jacket and headed out, ignoring Pierre's worried call. Walking through the streets of our neighborhood, I wondered what the future held in store for us. One thing was certain, nothing would ever be the same again. The days following Pierre's revelation were among the most difficult of my life. I spent my nights tossing and turning in our bed, unable to get to sleep, while Pierre slept on the sofa in the living room. The gulf between us seemed to widen with each passing hour. My parents, though worried, respected our privacy. I could hear them whispering to each other, exchanging worried glances when they thought I couldn't see them. Their presence, once a source of comfort, now added another layer of guilt to my inner torment. One evening, as I stared at the ceiling of our bedroom, lost in thought, my mother knocked gently on the door. "Amelie, my darling," she said as we entered, "may I speak to you for a moment?" I straightened up in bed, beckoning my mother to sit beside me. She took my hand in hers, her eyes filled with motherly concern. "You know," she began, "your father and I have been talking. We think it might be best for us to leave." I shook my head sharply. "No, Mom. It's not because of you. It's..." She interrupted me gently. "We know that, darling. But we can't ignore the fact that our presence here has contributed to this situation. We don't want to be the cause of problems between you and Pierre." Tears welled up in my eyes. "But where will you go? Dad still hasn't found a job." My mother smiled weakly. "Don't worry about us. We'll manage. What matters is that you make the right decision for yourself." Her words resonated with me long after she'd left the room. What was the right decision? My heart was torn between my love for Pierre and the betrayal I felt. The next morning, I decided to go for a walk, hoping the fresh air would help me clear my thoughts. Without really thinking about it, my steps led me to the little park where Pierre had proposed to me 3 years earlier. I sat on the bench where we'd spent hours talking about our future, making plans, dreaming of the life we'd build together. It was here, sitting on this bench full of memories, that I really began to think about our situation. I thought back to all the moments Pierre and I had shared, the good and the bad. I remembered how he had supported me when I lost my first job, how patient he had been when I decided to go back to school. I thought of his laughter, the way his eyes lit up when he looked at me, the warmth of his arms around me. But I also thought of his weakness in the face of his mother, the way he'd considered giving in to her demands without telling me. I wondered if I could ever fully trust him again. As the sun began to set, I realized I'd been sitting there for hours. My phone vibrated in my pocket, several worried messages from Pierre and my parents. I ignored them for the moment, knowing I had to get my thoughts in order first. I returned home, my mind still racing. Pierre was sitting in the living room, looking haggard and worried. When he saw me, he jumped to his feet. "Amelie," he said, his voice trembling, "I was so worried. Where have you been?" I looked at him for a long moment before answering. I needed to think, Pierre, to make a decision. He nodded, looking resigned. "And, have you made a decision?" I took a deep breath. "Yes. But before I tell you, I need you to listen to me. Really listen to me." Pierre sat down, and I took my place opposite him. "Pierre, what happened? It hurt me deeply. Not just the fact that you considered giving in to your mother's demands, but the fact that you didn't talk to me about it. We're supposed to be partners, we're supposed to face problems together." He lowered his eyes, ashamed. "I know. I'm so sorry, Amelie." I continued, determined to say all that was in my heart. "I realized something today. Our marriage, our love, is something precious. Something worth fighting for. But for it to work, we have to be a team. We have to trust each other, support each other, and never let anyone else come between us." Pierre lifted his head, hope shining in his eyes. "You mean?" I nodded. "I mean, I'm willing to try to save our marriage. But it won't be easy, Pierre. We have a lot of work to do." He rose and came to kneel before me, taking my hands in his. "I'll do whatever it takes, Amelie. I promise. I'll talk to my mom, I'll set clear boundaries. You're my priority, you and the family we're building together." I felt the tears roll down my cheeks. "I need you to prove it, Pierre. Not just in words, but in deeds." He nodded vigorously. I will. I promise. And so we remained for a long moment, hand in hand, aware that this was the beginning of a new chapter in our lives together. A chapter that would require work, patience, and a lot of love. The next few days were intense. Pierre had a long telephone conversation with his mother, firmly explaining that his demands were unacceptable and that if he had to choose, he would always choose me. I could hear his voice trembling, but he remained firm. When he hung up, he looked exhausted but relieved. She's not happy, he told me, but I think she understands that I'm serious. We also decided to start couples therapy, recognizing that we needed help to rebuild trust and improve our communication. As for my parents, despite our protests, they insisted on moving out. They found a small apartment not too far away, and my father eventually landed a part-time job. Their departure was painful, but I knew it was necessary so that Pierre and I could really work on our relationship. The night they left, as Pierre and I sat on the couch, exhausted but together, I realized that despite all the pain and uncertainty of the last few weeks, I was proud of us. Proud that we had chosen to fight for our love rather than give up. I rested my head on Pierre's shoulder, and he put his arm around me. We'll make it, he murmured. Together. And for the first time in a long time, I really believed it. Our path would not be easy, but we were determined to walk it together, hand in hand, no matter what. This difficult decision, to fight for our marriage despite the odds, would shape our future in ways I couldn't yet imagine. But one thing was certain, whatever the future held, we would face it together, stronger and more united than ever. The weeks that followed our decision to save our marriage were intense and trying. Pierre and I struggled to rebuild our relationship, stone by stone, like rebuilding a house after a storm. Our couple therapy sessions were sometimes painful, exposing insecurities and problems we'd ignored for too long. But each session brought us a little closer, strengthening the foundations of our love. However, despite our best efforts, I couldn't help feeling a persistent anxiety. The threat of Françoise, Pierre's mother, still hung over us like a dark cloud. Although Pierre stood up to her on the phone, I knew she wouldn't give up so easily. One evening, as we sat in our garden, enjoying a glass of wine after dinner, Pierre noticed my preoccupied expression. "What are you thinking about, my love?" he asked softly. I sighed, staring at my glass. "I'm thinking about your mother, Pierre. I can't help worrying that she's coming back for you." Pierre took my hand in his. "I know. I think about it often, too. But I promised you I wouldn't let her come between us again, and I'll keep that promise." I nodded, grateful for his determination, but still worried. "I believe you, Pierre. But your mother is persistent. I'm afraid she'll find some way to harm us, even if it's not directly." Pierre remained silent for a moment, thinking. Then he straightened up suddenly, a gleam of determination in his eyes. "What if we took the lead?" he said. I looked at him, intrigued. "What do you mean?" "Well," he began, "my mother wants this house, doesn't she? She thinks she can manipulate us into getting it. But what if the house was no longer an issue?" I frowned, not understanding what he was getting at. "Are you suggesting we move?" Pierre shook his head. "No, not exactly. I think we should sell the house." I stared at him, speechless. "Sell the house?" "But Pierre, we worked so hard for it. It's our home." He took both my hands in his. "I know, Amélie. Believe me, the idea breaks my heart too. But think about it. This house has become a symbol of conflict, of manipulation. Every time we walk through the door, we think of my mother's threat. Is this really how we want to live?" I remained silent, letting his words sink in. He was right. This house, which had been our dream, was now tainted by François' machinations. Besides, Pierre continued, if we sell the house, my mother will no longer have any leverage over us. We'll be able to start afresh, in a place that will truly be our own, without the shadow of her influence. The idea was beginning to make its way into my mind. It was radical, yes, but perhaps exactly what we needed. A fresh start, a chance to build something together, without anyone's interference. What if we did it in secret, suggested I, getting caught up in the game. We could put the house up for sale discreetly, without telling your mother. When that's done, It'll be too late for her to intervene. Pierre's eyes lit up. It's brilliant, Amélie. We could even add a little touch of, shall we say, poetic justice. I raised an eyebrow, curious. What do you mean? A mischievous smile played on her lips. Well, my mother wanted us to live on the street, didn't she? What would you say if, once the house was sold, we put a sign out front saying sold, live on the street? I couldn't help laughing. It was childish, sure, but there was something satisfying about the idea. Are you sure? Isn't that a bit petty? Pierre shrugged. Maybe. But after everything she's put us through, I think we can afford it. Besides, it'll make her understand once and for all that we're not going to be manipulated anymore. We spent the rest of the evening fine-tuning our plan. The next morning, we discreetly contacted a trusted real estate agent. We explained our situation and our need for discretion. He understood perfectly and assured us that he could handle the sale confidentially. The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Between discreet visits from potential buyers, our therapy sessions and our jobs, we barely had time to breathe. But every time I felt doubt, I thought of the promise of a new beginning, of a life free of Francois's shadow. Against all odds, the house sold quickly. The market was favorable and our agent had done an excellent job. The evening we signed the sale papers, Pierre and I sat on the floor of our empty living room, sharing a bottle of champagne. To our new beginning, Pierre said, raising his glass. To our new beginning, I repeated, my heart filled with a mixture of nostalgia and excitement. The next morning, as we loaded the last boxes into the moving van, Pierre pulled out a sign he had made in secret. In black letters on a white background, it read, sold. Live on the street. I couldn't help but laugh when I saw her. It was childish, of course, but also incredibly liberating. Pierre planted it proudly in front of the house. Are you sure you want to do this? I asked one last time. He nodded determinedly. Absolutely. It's our way of telling my mother that we'll never let ourselves be manipulated again. As we climbed into the car, ready to leave for our new lives, I took one last look at our old home. So many memories, good and bad, were locked within these walls. But when I saw the provocative sign planted in the garden, I couldn't help smiling. We had regained control of our lives. Ready? Asked Pierre as he started the car. I took his hand in mine. More than ever. As we pulled away, I knew it wasn't really a farewell to our old life, but rather a goodbye to the version of ourselves that had allowed itself to be manipulated and bullied. Before us lay a new chapter, full of promise and opportunity. And this time, we would write it together, on our own terms. The sun was just rising when we heard the squeal of tires in the driveway. Pierre and I exchanged a meaningful glance. We knew this moment would come, but we didn't think it would be so soon. It's her, Pierre murmured, his hand clasping mine. I nodded, taking a deep breath to prepare myself for what was to come. We were barely settled into our new apartment, boxes still stacked in every corner. But we were ready. We'd rehearsed this moment in our heads dozens of times. The doorbell rang, shrill and insistent. Pierre got up slowly, giving me one last reassuring look before opening the door. Maman, I heard him say in a calm voice. Pierre, what does this mean? Francois's voice was high-pitched, tinged with anger and disbelief. I saw the sign in front of your house. This is a joke, right? I rose and joined Pierre at the door. Francoise was standing there, her usually composed face distorted by rage. Her eyes rested on me, shining with fury. You, she spat. You're the one who put this ridiculous idea into my son's head, aren't you? Before I could reply, Pierre intervened. That's enough, Maman. Come in, we need to talk. Francoise hesitated for a moment, then entered the apartment, her gaze sweeping disdainfully over our new living space. So, she said, turning to us, explain. What is this madness? Pierre took a deep breath. It's not madness, Maman. It's our decision. Amélie and I have sold the house. Francois's face went from anger to amazement. Sold? But, why? How could you do such a thing without telling me? Why should we have talked to you about it? Replied Pierre calmly. This house was ours, not yours. Francoise turned to me, her eyes flashing. You put him up to this, didn't you? You manipulated him against his own mother. I felt anger welling up inside me, but I tried to remain calm. No, Francoise. It was both our decisions. A decision we made together, as a couple. Lies, she cried. My Pierre would never have done such a thing on his own. You've changed him, you've taken him away from me. Pierre took a step forward, placing himself between his mother and me. That's enough, Mom. You can't keep blaming Amélie. I'm the one who suggested selling the house. Francoise looked at him, incredulous. But, why? Because, Pierre continued, his voice firm but gentle, this house had become a symbol of manipulation and emotional blackmail. Every time we entered it, we thought of your threats, your attempt to separate us. Francoise's eyes widened. My threats. But I only wanted the best for you, my darling. That girl, she's not good enough for you. And her parents who lived with you. I felt Pierre tense up beside me, but his voice remained calm. Amélie is my wife, Maman. She's the person I chose to share my life with. And her parents needed help. That's what families do, they help each other. But I'm your family, protested Francoise. I've always been there for you. Yes, nodded Pierre, you've always been there. But being there doesn't mean you have the right to control my life or threaten my marriage. Francoise seemed to deflate, collapsing onto the nearest sofa. I don't understand, she murmured. I've always done what I thought was best for you. I stepped forward gently, sitting down opposite her. Francoise, I said gently, we know you love Pierre. We don't question that. But love shouldn't be conditional or manipulative. She looked up at me, and for the first time, I saw vulnerability in her gaze. I didn't mean to manipulate. I was just afraid of losing him. Pierre knelt beside his mother, taking her hands in his. You'll never lose me, Maman. I'll always be your son. But you have to understand that I have my own life now, with Amélie. We're a team, and we make our decisions together. Francoise nodded slowly, tears beginning to roll down her cheeks. I'm sorry, she murmured. I didn't realize. I thought I was doing the right thing. I felt my own throat tighten. For all the pain she'd caused us, seeing Francoise like this, vulnerable and repentant, touched me. We can move forward, I said softly. But that means setting new boundaries, new ways of communicating. Pierre nodded. Yes, Mom. We want you to be part of our lives, but as a support, not as a controlling force. Francoise looked at us in turn, then nodded slowly. I'll try. I don't want to lose you. We spent the next few hours talking, really talking, for the first time in years. Francoise shared her fears, her insecurities. We explained our point of view, our hopes for the future. It wasn't easy, and there were moments of tension, but we persevered. When Francoise finally left late that evening, the atmosphere had changed. It wasn't a miracle years of toxic behavior don't disappear in a single conversation, but it was a start. Pierre closed the door behind his mother and turned to me, pulling me into his arms. We did it, he whispered against my hair. I nodded, exhausted but relieved. Yes, we did. Together. That night, lying in our new bed, in our new apartment, Pierre and I talked for a long time about the future. We knew that the road ahead would be long and sometimes difficult. Rebuilding a healthy relationship with Francoise would take time and effort. But for the first time in a long time, we felt truly free. You know, Pierre said, gently caressing my arm, I think selling the house was the best decision we ever made. I smiled in the darkness. So am I. It was more than a house we sold. It was our fears, our doubts, our old habits. And now, he continued, we can build something new. Something that's truly ours. I snuggled against him, feeling his heart beat against mine. Yes, I murmured. Our new beginning. As sleep overtook us, I realized that this was not the end of our story, but rather the beginning of a new chapter. A chapter filled with hope, love, and the promise of a better future. Together, Pierre and I had weathered the storm and emerged stronger. And now, hand in hand, we were ready to face whatever life might throw at us. The months that followed our confrontation with Francoise were both stimulating and testing. Pierre and I had embarked on a new adventure, that of rebuilding our lives from scratch. Our new apartment, though smaller than our old home, had become our sanctuary, a space where we could finally breathe freely, without the weight of expectations and manipulations. The divorce process was difficult, but necessary. Each signature, each completed document was a painful reminder of the end of something, but also the beginning of something new. Pierre stayed by my side throughout the process, supporting me in moments of doubt and sadness. "Are you sure this is what you want?" he asked me one evening, as we sat on our little balcony, watching the sun set over the city. I took a deep breath, feeling the cool evening air fill my lungs. "Yes," I replied with a certainty that surprised even myself. "It's not easy, but it's necessary. For both of us." He nodded, squeezing my hand in his. "I'm proud of you, Amelie. Of us. We've been through so much, but we're still here, together." Those words resonated with me, reminding me why we'd made all those difficult decisions. We were together, stronger than ever. At the same time as the divorce, we had begun to rebuild our relationship with Francoise. It wasn't an easy process. There were relapses, moments when she tried to regain control, to interfere in our decisions. But each time, Pierre remained firm, setting clear limits with love but firmness. We had also begun to reconnect with my parents. Their move to a small apartment had been difficult for them, but they were gradually adjusting. My father had finally found a steady job, and my mother had discovered a passion for community gardening. One Sunday, we invited them to lunch in our new apartment. The atmosphere was different from our family meals of yesteryear, more relaxed, more authentic. There was no more underlying tension, no more unspoken secrets. "You know," my father said, raising his glass, "I'm really proud of both of you. You've faced adversity with courage and integrity." My mother nodded, tears in her eyes. "You've shown us what it really means to be a family, supporting each other, even in the most difficult times." I felt my throat tighten with emotion. "Thank you," I murmured. "We couldn't have done it without your support." Pierre took my hand under the table, squeezing it gently. "We're lucky to have such a loving family," he added. That moment, surrounded by the people I loved most in the world, made me realize how much we had grown and evolved. We weren't the same people who had bought that first house with so much hope and excitement. We were stronger, wiser, more resilient. The weeks passed, and little by little, we began to build our new lives. I resumed my studies, deciding to pursue a dream I'd long put aside, to become a social worker. I wanted to help other people through difficult times, to find their inner strength as we had done. Pierre, for his part, decided to launch his own consulting business. He had always had a talent for solving problems and helping others reach their full potential. Now, freed from the weight of his mother's expectations, he could finally pursue his passion. Our evenings were often spent studying together, me immersed in my psychology textbooks, him working on his business plan. It was a new kind of intimacy, different from what we'd known before, but just as precious. One evening, as we were taking a well-deserved break, Pierre turned to me with a mischievous smile. "You know," he said, "I think we should celebrate." I raised an eyebrow, puzzled. "Celebrating what?" "Us," he replied simply. "Our new beginning. Our freedom. Our love." The next evening, Pierre took me to dinner at a small, intimate restaurant we'd never tried before. The ambience was warm, the candles on the table creating a romantic atmosphere. As we savored our dessert, Pierre took my hand over the table. "Amelie," he began, his voice slightly trembling, "these last few months have been the most difficult of my life. But they've also been the most revealing. I realized how strong, brave, and loving you are. You've shown me what it really means to be a partner, in good times and bad." I felt tears welling up in my eyes, moved by his words. "I know we've been married before," he continued, "but I was wondering if you'd like to renew our vows. Not for the outside world, not for my mother or anyone else. Just for us. To celebrate the new us we've become." I was speechless. This unexpected proposal touched me deeply. It was as if Pierre was acknowledging everything we'd been through and expressing his desire to continue this journey together. "Yes," I finally whispered, tears running freely down my cheeks. "Yes, I'd love that." A few weeks later, we found ourselves on a quiet beach, just the two of us, the sun setting on the horizon. No elaborate ceremony, no guests, just us and the vastness of the ocean. We exchanged new vows, promises that reflected our growth, resilience, and renewed love. Pierre promised to always communicate openly, respect my boundaries, and support my dreams. I promised to be his partner in all aspects of life, to help him stay strong in the face of adversity, and to always believe in us. As the sun disappeared over the horizon, tinting the sky pink and gold, I realized that this moment truly marked a new beginning. We had weathered the storm and emerged stronger, more united. It hadn't been an easy road. We'd lost a house, faced family conflicts, questioned our relationship. But through it all, we had gained something far more precious, a deeper understanding of ourselves and our love. As we walked hand in hand along the beach, the waves gently licking our feet, I knew with certainty that whatever the future held, we would face it together. For we had learned the most important lesson of all: true love lies not in a house or the approval of others, but in the strength we find in each other. Our new beginning wasn't just a new chapter, it was a new story. A story of love, resilience, and growth. And I couldn't wait to see where it would take us.